Welcome back to the Hawks Zone Rundown. On today's show, Seahawks beat writer Corbin Smith joins us. Also, Locked On Seahawks is his podcast. He's coming on to talk. Well, you know what? We're still talking draft, man. We got a couple of weeks till the draft. We want to get his opinion on things like the QB situation. That's a hot topic. Also talk about some of the players that he might think that if we stick and pick at 16, who does he like? Who are his non-negotiable stick and picks? And if we do stick and pick at 16, what's John Schneider's strategy between 16 and 81? B. Rice, I know you're excited about this pod. What's going on, man?
Not much, man. I'm really excited to ask Corbin some of these questions. He's really dialed into the organization and the team. I can't wait to get this going. See what his thoughts are on this upcoming draft that we're less than 10 days away from now.
Yeah, it's just been a lot of obviously a lot of draft talk coming up. We've been, you and I started talking about stuff even as far back as a couple months ago when we started talking, quarterback situation. And, at the beginning, we were convinced that they're taking a QB. There's just no question about it. Of course, then we talked about, the Sam Howell trade and how much, that was interesting. And does that change things? And we kind of went back and forth and we've had guys on and even our latest guest, when we talked to Emery about, the 2025 draft class at quarterbacks and how a lot of people have sort of been like all of a sudden already dogging that class and saying, nah, it's a terrible class. And you talk to Emery and he said, no, you know what? There's guys to look out for. So, it's going to be interesting. And, I definitely want to get Corbin's take on that as well and see what he thinks of the 25 class. And, in case, we don't pick up a quarterback and then fans are screaming and being like, what is Schneider doing? Like, he needs a quarterback. And, as we've been talking to guys and realizing, hey, you know what? And we've talked about it, 24 could be this building block. And you get your team right. And then, not that we don't want one, but maybe if they don't take one, there's a reason for that, right?
100%, man. And I honestly think, I'm starting to get the vibe that there's tiering to their draft strategy, and there's a group of positions that are tier 1, a group of positions that are tier 2, and then tier 3. And if it's for me, tier 1 is D tackle. You've got to come out of here with an enforcing factor at D tackle. I know we have Leonard Williams, but we need a guy in there because Hankins and Jaron Reed are both getting older. Cam Young really hasn't come into play. I know he's coming into his second year. Hopefully he takes a step. But if there's an impact guy, whether it's Newton or Byron Murphy that's sitting there, I think you got to take him. And the other spot I would say is offensive guard in that tier 1. And an offensive guard that is not solely just a guard. He can be multiple, like a Barton, a Troy Fautanu, a guy that can play up and down the line, And my big reason on why I like Fautanu the most out of them all is we don't know if Charles Cross takes a step next year and gets any better. And, it may lead to a point where he becomes part of trade talks maybe next year for Seattle. Right. If he doesn't take a step and you bounce out Fautanu out to left tackle, or if Abe Lucas has injury problems consisting and persisting, then we move him over to the right side. So you want to have that flexibility. And in my tier 2, that's where I see quarterback. I see quarterback and safety and linebacker as that tier 2 group of positions that we need to fill. And tier 3 for me is going to be running back. Like, if they don't take a running back, I'm not going to be upset. We have 3 on the board, or 3 on the roster, I should say. And we've got, UDFA for that as well, if you're going to fill out some of those spots going into camp. So that's how I tier this draft for Seattle and the positions of need and where they need to focus, most of their resources at. So we'll see if it kind of lines up with what Corbin thinks.
Yeah, we'll get into all that and a little more. So Corbin Smith on the other side.
Well, I'm the best corner in the game. What a run. Marshawn Lynch. Get off me.
DK. Hey, it's John Schneider with Seattle Seahawks.
That's the results going
This offense just in general. I mean, you had a guy like
watching
that.
his film, he seems more of a back.
Just the presence he's got in that pocket, the way he throws the football. Rust days, man, all the scrutiny that line was under.
This Monday night's big.
Hey guys, welcome back to the show. With us today is Corbin Smith, beat writer for the Seattle Seahawks, and also Locked On Seahawks podcast. Corbin, we appreciate you coming on and talking Hawks with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it. Looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. Let's get into it. We're obviously a couple of weeks away from the draft, and there's talks about, John Schneider now on his own, and we're sitting there at number 16 right now, and it's an interesting situation to be in. Obviously, last year we got that generational number 5 pick, and everyone was super excited about it. What are we going to do there? And there was rumors about, if Anthony Richardson was there at 5, a lot of people, there was talks that, the Hawks were probably going to go there and possibly draft Anthony Richardson, maybe, a quarterback for the future. He can have the luxury of sitting behind Geno Smith for at least a season, maybe 2 seasons, and then, bring him up in the system, kind of like a la Jordan Love and the Green Bay Packers. Obviously, that didn't happen. He goes number 4 to the Colts. So now, fast forward, Geno Smith, mid-30s, and, we were, before the Sam Howell move, we thought for sure they're drafting a QB. Now, and then those talks sort of simmered down a bit, and then there was talks a little more when, say, Penix had his pro day and looking really good. What do you think they're going to do with the quarterback situation and addressing a guy for the future in this draft?
I think that it's probably more likely they're going to try to kick the can down the road to next year, unless, and John Schneider's discussed this, you always got to have a fluid process when you're in the draft. So maybe they are really high on bringing Michael Penix Jr. in and reuniting him with Ryan Grubb. I can't see them doing that at pick number 16, though, especially after trading for Sam Howell. If somehow they traded down and got a second-round pick and somehow Michael Penix Jr. fell to them in the second round, I think that's very unlikely that's going to happen. But we've seen crazier things happen in the draft. If he was available in the second round and they now had a pick to use on him, that may change the dynamic completely. So I'm not going to sit here and say that it's impossible. They could take a flyer on a guy late on day 3, too. They had John Rice Plumlee from UCF in for a top 30. Maybe that's a project quarterback that they could look at in the later rounds. But I think that bringing in Sam Howell, he's younger than most of these quarterbacks that are in this draft class, and he's got 18 starts under him. So I don't know at this point. John Schneider said the right things as far as it's not going to change their process. If the right guy is available at the right pick, they could go with a quarterback. But I think it's more likely that this is going to be something where they're looking towards 2025 as the possibility to go get their QB. They don't have the capital to move up to get somebody either. So I think that was part of the rationale behind trading for Sam Howell as well.
So in regards to Sam Howell, Corbin, do you see him as a bridge guy for in case they don't want to bring back Geno next year at his cap hit, so they have someone on the roster for that 2025 possibility of bringing in their rookie quarterback? Or do you see Sam Howell being more than just here for this year and next year, which is the duration of his contract?
I think that there is still a high upside starter in Sam Howell. And I was higher on him than a lot of people when he was coming out of North Carolina. And I think a lot of people forgot his last year at the Tar Heels, he kind of had to reinvent himself a little bit because all 3 of his top receivers got drafted that year. And so they kind of had to transition towards more of a running offense, including him being a big-time runner. And he rushed for over 800 yards in his final year at North Carolina. He's a really good athlete that has the ability to create with his legs beyond just scrambling to pass the football. He can do damage as a runner, and he's got the arm talent to be able to make all the throws. He got put in a really bad situation last year in Washington, and I think some of that's got to fall on Eric Bieniemy, the offensive coordinator. They had a run game that at times was efficient, but they just refused to lean on it, and that's why he threw more than any quarterback in the NFL last year. So I think that had more to do with the high interception numbers. He's got to work some things out with his decision-making, but I don't look at him as a guy that is turnover prone necessarily. When he throws 610 plus times, you're going to throw some interceptions, and his turnover rate, his interception rate was a little over 3%. That's not great, but I've seen some pretty good quarterbacks have worse percentages than that. So I still think there's a starting quarterback, a long-term starter there in the right situation. Is Seattle the right situation? We'll find out. The nice thing, guys, is they get 2 years to really take an audition with him. This is not a one-year flyer like what Drew Lock really was, and they ended up re-signing him for another year. You're getting 2 years on a very affordable day 3 quarterback contract. And so if it ends up working out, it's an outstanding trade for them. And if not, if he doesn't become a starter, that's okay. You didn't give up that much. You swapped picks. So I think there's a starter there, but we'll see what happens.
So with that said, Corbin, do you envision there being a true competition in camp, or do you think there'll be one that's kind of a hidden competition between Gino and Sam for the position? Because there was a comment John Schneider made, I think it was just after they actually made the trade for Sam Howell, in regards to, well, when we brought Drew in, Drew didn't really get to compete with Gino because he got COVID, and it just kind of derailed that whole competition. Do you think they're going to actually let Sam compete to be QB1, or do you still think it's just Gino's job, Sam come here, learn the spot, and then maybe next year we'll see if you're QB1 material?
I think this is Gino's job. John Schneider has said that multiple times. Mike MacDonald has come out now and said that. I don't envision this being a competition. With that being said, there's going to be a microscope on Sam Howell from this coaching staff, because they want to see – this guy is an intense competitor. They want to see him put that work in and really give him extended snaps. I think he's going to get more opportunities than what you see from some backup quarterbacks, because this team does want to see, is there the potential that in 2025 this guy could be the starter? And who knows, this could be one of those fluid situations. If Sam Howell has an amazing offseason program and he starts off hot in training camp, I don't think it's going to suddenly turn into a competition. But it might be one of those things, if Geno Smith comes out slow out of the gate like he did last year, that the Seahawks could very easily say, look, this is still a transition period, first-time head coach. Now we may have more incentive to see what we truly have in Sam Howell playing on Sundays. But I don't envision this being a competition right now. There is intrigue about him being a starter, but I think 2025, right now, he's trying to earn the opportunity to maybe be a starter in 2025, in my opinion.
So, Corbin, you look down the road at 2025, and we look at 24 as a building block for the Seahawks, right? Like, obviously some glaring needs still with the offensive line and things of that nature. Just staying with the quarterback just for a minute here. A couple guys that we're high on later, well, possibly later on in the draft. One, Spencer Rattler, and the other one, Jordan Travis, who broke his leg. And we look at that as a guy that kind of teams are sleeping on a bit. And there's a guy that you could bring in, and there's no expectations. The fans aren't screaming like, hey, you drafted the guy early. What are your thoughts on those two players that maybe if a day 3 comes along and someone like that's available, do you see them sort of still looking at a guy? I mean, I know they brought in Spencer Rattler, right? What are your thoughts on those two guys as a possibility?
Spencer Rattler is not going to make it to day 3. I'd be stunned if he is there in the 4th round. In fact, I'm not necessarily a betting guy, but I think there's a better chance he's gone in the 2nd round than he gets picked in the 3rd round. I think that he is a player that the league is higher on than draft experts are. And when you go back and you watch the film, you can see why. The numbers don't necessarily stack up to some of these other quarterbacks, but he wasn't in a system that necessarily was conducive to slinging the ball over the place. He wasn't in an RPO-heavy system. That's the big thing that Bo Nix is going to be fighting in this process. Going back and watching Oregon's tape, they gave him a lot of really easy reads, and there's a lot of yards after the catch, so that kind of inflates the numbers a little bit. Spencer Rattler had to work for everything that he got on a team that, quite frankly, I think it was one of your 2 or 3 worst teams in terms of overall talent in the SEC. They just don't have the blue chippers across the board that stack up with some of these teams. There have been some issues with him getting rattled, ironically enough, with the pass rush getting after him. But I think that he's got all of the physical tools. And it's crazy. I didn't think he was going to run a 4.95 40, because when you watch him on film, he looks much more spry than that and can run the football. But I think that he is clearly a day 2 guy. The Seahawks, if he's in the 3rd round there, that might be one of those players that if 81 ends up being the sweet spot, maybe they would consider going that route. As for Jordan Travis, I'm not quite as high on him as what some people are. I have some questions about the NFL arm talent with him. And I also look at the low slot. I actually saw, I believe, Bryce, that you were the one I saw a quote tweeted today, video of him working out. I think it's awesome that he's back from the fractured, dislocated ankle. Could be a guy that's a fun developmental project, but I see that really low release that he's got. That always concerns me as far as passes getting swatted down, things of that nature. And he also gets the ball, he elongates it before he throws it. So I feel like there's some technical stuff that's going to have to be shored up. I could see him being a solid backup in the league, and maybe in the perfect situation, fully healthy, maybe he's one of those guys that could be a day 3 dark horse. But as far as those day 3 guys, Michael Pratt is the quarterback that I think is going to be a really solid NFL QB, who is a fantastic athlete, and he makes really smart decisions with the football, not going to turn the ball over very much. Maybe he doesn't have the biggest arm, not the most arm talent, but he's accurate. He throws with anticipation, really athletic guy. He's the day 3 quarterback, and the Seahawks talked to him at the combine. I know for a fact that there's interest there. He could be a player in day 3 because of his mobility, his decision-making, his accuracy. He's got above average arm strength, not elite arm strength, but he has a strong enough arm that you can run Ryan Grubb's offense the way that he ran it at Washington. And I think that this is a kid that on day 3, if he was available and the Seahawks wanted to go quarterback route, I could see Michael Pratt being somebody that they're certainly interested in.
Yeah, no, I've watched Michael Pratt's film as well, Corbin, and that was the one thing I kind of came away with them is he doesn't have that elite arm, but he's kind of reminds me of the Joe Burrow arm, where it can make the throws you need it to make, but he's not going to be Patrick Mahomes on his back foot, launching it 65 yards down the field. But he is a very high percentage completion passer, and he goes through his progressions quickly and effectively, which is one thing, again, I look for at a quarterback, like coming from that transition to college to the NFL. How quickly can you get in and off into your check down if it's there? And yeah, I could see definitely Michael Pratt being a guy they want to take a chance on, at least in the 3rd round, if they have the draft capital to possibly do that in the late 3rd or 3rd day of the draft.
Yeah, if they're able to get another day 2 pick or 2 day 2 picks. I mean, we've seen John Schneider trade down multiple times in the 1st round, a couple times. It's happened. This could be a year where that makes sense potentially, because a lot of those teams at the end of the 1st round, they're needing receivers, they're needing tackles. This is a really good draft class for both. If there's the right player there at 16, Seattle could get a king's ransom that's much higher than you see on those draft tech charts out there. So they could maybe recoup multiple picks on day 2. And if that happens, they've got 2 picks in the 4th round too. Maybe that 102 selection is the sweet spot for Michael Pratt. I could see him being a guy that's high on John Schneider's list if they want to go that route.
So, speaking about that 16th pick, and because it's a unique kind of situation, we gave up our 2nd round pick when we traded for Leonard Williams last season, and so now you're sitting there 16, and the gap is pretty big. You're 16 to 81. Do you think it's a given that Schneider is trading down, based on what you just said, plus that gap, and just because that sweet spot that he likes, and just to at least get in the 2nd round a little bit, and maybe accumulate a few more picks, or do you think that it's like it's so quarterback heavy that you might at 16 have a guy that you just can't get away from, and you just want to sit there and stick and pick? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that with the recent moves that some of those teams in the back half of the 1st round have made, for example, Buffalo trading Stephon Diggs, like they basically have a bunch of mailmen playing receiver on that team right now.
Yeah,
they're going to have to do something to try to add some weapons for Josh Allen. And so I could see a situation where Buffalo might be a team that calls Seattle 16 to try to jump up from 28. And that's a big gap. So you might have to give up a 2nd and a 3rd plus your 1st to do that. But if there's a receiver that you are enthralled with, then that might be a move that ends up happening there. I would say at this point, to me, it's 80% to 20%. I think there's a 20% chance they sit, because I do think that there are a few players there that if they fell to them, and the one that to me is number one on this list, I've been told that they are extremely high on Jared Verse out of Florida State. And you watch the film, you can see why. If that kid falls to them at number 16, I don't think John Schneider, and I think Mike MacDonald is going to be slamming his fist in the table. I don't care who our edge guys are. That guy is a potential all-pro player. If he falls to you at number 16, he plays the run well. He can win with power and speed. Look at his path to the NFL. The guy was a tight end at the University of Albany, and within 2 years turned into a first-round caliber pass rusher. He's still relatively new to that position, yet he's so polished compared to a lot of guys. So if a player like that, or Troy Fautanu, that is the kind of offensive lineman Seattle could draft at number 16. I don't think they're going to guard a lot. That just would go against John Schneider's roster building philosophies. But a tackle that could play guard like Troy Fautanu, it gives you a guy that can start on day one. And it also puts heat on Charles Cross. He's got 2 years, maybe 3 with that 5th-year option left on his contract. And you can kind of nudge him a little bit like, hey, we just drafted a guy that could start at left tackle in the NFL. If you don't take that big step we want, he might be somebody that they could put in the market next year and potentially move. So I think those are 2 names there. And again, I don't like throwing the wild card out there. He visited the Seahawks today. Cooper DeJean, to me, is this year's Devin Witherspoon. He is the guy that they talked to at the combine. They sent a scout to his individual pro day, and now they've had him into Seattle. That is not a smokescreen anymore. That is clearly a player that Mike MacDonald is very interested in. And you saw what he did with Kyle Hamilton. They're different players, but they both have that positional flexibility. 16 might be a little rich, and at the same time, there are murmurs now going around that there might be some teams ahead of Seattle looking at Cooper DeJean. So if he's there at 16, I know it's a secondary pick, and some might look at that as a waste of resources. I do not. You're talking about a guy that has a chance to be a superstar in the league, turns the football over as well as anybody, incredible instincts. He's a very good tackler. On top of that, everybody that follows Seahawks knows the secondary tackling has been an issue. You bring this guy in, he could start for you at safety day one, even though you signed a couple of guys. Who cares? They're going to be free agents next year. If this kid comes in, he can start for you. Those would be 3 names that would jump off the list right now to me, that at 16, John Schneider could look at, especially if the offers aren't coming in that people are suspecting. Those are 3 names. If they're available, I think Seattle could keep at 16 and decide to make a pick.
So, Corbin, I wanted to ask you on your opinion on 2 defensive tackles that are being talked about being day 1 picks, Byron Murphy and Newton out of Illinois. Between the 2 of them, who do you think Seattle would be more in favor of taking in the draft if one of them was there at 16 maybe, which they possibly both could be, or if Seattle trades back and they're still sitting there? Who do you think there's a more likelihood that they would take that fits maybe what they're about to do with Mike MacDonald's defense?
So it would be easy to look at the fact that the Seahawks had combine visits and a top 30 visit with Byron Murphy II and say he's got to be at the top of the list. But Johnny Newton has everything that Mike MacDonald would be looking for. You're talking about a player with a relentless motor, a really good run defender, outstanding pass rushing presence, very well-developed set of counter moves. On top of that, he's played big end. He's played 3-tech, even though some people say he's too small. He weighed in at 304 at the combine. He is not an Aaron Donald size guy. Not that Seattle would pass on an Aaron Donald, but my point is that he's bigger, I think, than some people realize, and he plays with such tenacity and such passion for the game. Those kind of guys jump out to John Schneider and to Mike MacDonald. I think Newton would probably be 1A and Murphy would be 1B. I think that these 2 guys are very close. Newton was the more productive player in college. Murphy might have more of an untapped potential, a higher ceiling, but those kind of picks can be a little bit dangerous when you're talking about potential. Johnny Newton's going to come into the league and be ready to feast right away. Murphy really came on last year. It just feels like Newton's a little bit ahead of the curve compared to Murphy right now, and that positional versatility that he gives. And ironically, both these guys were high school running backs at one point. So that's why, to me, it is a very close call, and I think Seattle would like to get either one of them. I just think Newton would probably have a very slight edge in that category.
Okay. Yeah, Corbin, it's funny when you brought up Cooper DeJean, because just before you came on, we were talking about him. We're high on him, and we look at that secondary, like you said, they brought in kind of like these short-term deals, like the linebacker room, obviously, kind of quote unquote almost tryout sort of like year, where it's like, okay, if somebody kind of maybe someone gets an extension, but you're also thinking about bringing in a rookie, right? And when we look at, say, even that corner room, right? Obviously, Devin Witherspoon's an absolute stud. Obviously, he's starting, and there's no question about that. But you talk about the corner room, for example, and you say, okay, it's pretty deep. You got Reek Wolin and Trey Brown and Mike Jack and all these guys. But then even a guy like Reek obviously had a great rookie year, and then just had a weird season last year, right? And there was questions about his tackling, his physicality, and all this kind of stuff. Do you think someone like that, like Mike MacDonald coming in and Reek, do you think he could even be a potential trade piece come draft day, and they're looking to say, hey, you know what, we're not done filling up that corner room?
I'd be surprised if the Seahawks are going to give up on a player of those physical tools that quickly. And you do have to remember that last year he was playing with a banged up shoulder for a big chunk of the season. And it was difficult to watch the tackling. And I think he did get a wake-up call when Pete Carroll put Mike Jackson in the starting lineup late in the season for a game. So I think that there's enough talent there. It's still only been 4 years that he's been playing that position. I find it hard to believe that Mike MacDonald's going to be saying, that's okay. Let's see if we can move on and bring somebody else in. I would say never applies to this, but at the same time, I'd be pretty surprised if they moved on. And you also have to consider that Mike Jackson and Trey Brown, Artie Burns, all those players are going to be free agents next year. They only have a couple of corners. I guess you could say 3 if you're including Kobe Bryant, but we don't necessarily know where he's going to be at position-wise. I mean, he might be competing for safety snaps. Yep. We don't know yet at this point. So at most, they've got 3 corners that are under contract for next year. So I think that this is kind of an under-the-radar position to add depth, but I would be really surprised if they're drafting anybody early. If they're picking Cooper DeJean, they're picking him as a safety that can play outside corner. Mike MacDonald runs such a unique defense in the sense that he is a master at pre-snap disguise. He's as good as any defensive coach out there doing that. But in order to do that, and he did it with Baltimore last year, he had a safety in Brandon Stevens that moved to outside corner, and he made it work. Like, he gets players that can play multiple positions, and he is able to mix and match them in his sub-package groups. And that just makes it that much harder for the offense to know what's coming, especially with their pre-snap disguises and having somewhat positionless secondary guys. Cooper DeJean would fit into that mold. And I think the tackling aspect, everybody talks about the ball skills, which are elite, but he missed 3 tackles the entire 2022 season. The guy is a stalwart coming up and smacking people. He was effective when they had him in the box on rare occasions. I just look at him as a player that Mike MacDonald would be drooling over. And the fact they've done all the stuff they've done, bringing him in for visits and stuff, I would not be surprised at all. It's much like Devin Witherspoon, who back last January, 2 Januaries ago, I was throwing that name out there saying, this guy is a Pete Carroll, John Schneider kind of guy. I would not be surprised if they're going to pick him at 5. I look at Cooper DeJean as that guy at number 16 this year, where it feels like there could be some deja vu going on here.
So speaking about that safety room, Corbin, because you brought it up there with Cooper DeJean, like we've said, you kind of have 1-year deals. Even Rayshawn Jenkins is really a 1-year kind of deal based the way it's structured. Julian Love's on the last year of his deal. They brought in Kayvon Wallace, and Kobe Bryant may or may not play safety or corner. We're not sure. The other name in there that I was really interested in last year and sadly got hurt was Jonathan Sutherland. And then I saw today they dropped the OTA speed, I guess, who got the highest speeds in their training and stuff. And he was one of the top guys in that, marking up there. And I think he was in the top 10. Do you think he has a potential of having an impact on this defense this year if he can stay healthy through OTAs and through training camp instead of having what happened to him last year?
he's one of the dark horses to watch because if he didn't get hurt last year, he would have made the roster. So the situation ended up being where Seattle had to put him on injured reserve, and it wasn't an injury that was season long. So they reached a settlement on that, and that happens sometimes in this league. But he was a player that Pete Carroll was very high on. And I think when you look at what he does well, he is viewed as a really good tackler. He's got special teams ability. He will be battling for one of those back half of the roster. What would aid his chances, another name that you guys didn't throw out there, I still think Jarek Reed II could be a long-term starter for this football team. And that torn ACL last year, unfortunately, who knows if he's going to be ready for the start of the season. I asked John Schneider about that at the league meetings, and he told me they're not sure if he's going to be ready. He's making good progress, but he had that injury late in the season, so they are not going to be rushing him back either. That is a guy that has positional flexibility, that played slot, free safety, and box safety at New Mexico and was an all-conference player, even though New Mexico has perennially been one of the worst programs in the FBS level. And he's got great athletic tools. He can tackle. If he comes back healthy, that is the name to watch. But if he's hurt at the beginning of the season or working his way back, then that would really open the door for Jonathan Sutherland to make this football team. So those depth guys, I feel like, especially when you're looking at somebody like Kayvon Wallace, we've seen the Seahawks sign players to one-year deals and then cut them in training camp. It's happened before. Maybe Kayvon Wallace ends up being that guy if somebody like a Jarek Reed II comes back healthy, or Jonathan Sutherland plays well, both those guys play well, Kobe Bryant plays well at safety. Suddenly you're like, wait, do we need this guy? So maybe he ends up being somebody that plays a lot of snaps for you. But I think that they have some flexibility there, and there's some question marks. What's this group going to look like once we get to the start of the season?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, we've talked a lot about the defensive side of the ball. Obviously, Mike MacDonald, defensive coach, now head coach, and obviously, 31st in run defense. Just a lot of things to clean up going into next season. You look on the other side of the ball and the offense. Obviously, we touched on quarterback, and we know obviously the offensive line. There's holes there, and even question marks with like you mentioned, Charles Cross. We got to push you a little bit. The rest of the, you look at the skill positions, obviously receiver, JSN, DK, Tyler, restructured the backs. Tyler getting older. We think maybe he might play one more year and sort of, sail off in the sunset and do his real estate thing. Do you think kind of a dark horse in this draft could be later on, like picking up another young receiver and kind of getting a little cheaper there as well, and then having the ability to put that money elsewhere later on down the road?
Yeah, I don't know if this is a hot take, but I could see if the right player is available in the first 3 rounds, depending on how many picks they end up with. If there's a receiver that falls further than expected, especially one of those Washington receivers, if they have a chance to reunite him with Ryan Grubb, I could see a situation where Seattle goes that route. I think it's more likely that day 3, that's when they would take a flyer. And I would anticipate it would be on a guy that's got kick and punt return ability. So the one that I've been talking up is Jaquan Jackson from Tulane, who caught passes for Michael Pratt and didn't have the gaudiest stat line there. They ran the football quite a bit at Tulane, but had really good kick and punt return numbers. He's an explosive athlete, might be one of those guys that's a better NFL player than a college player. Those are the kind of guys that I would anticipate on day 3. It's kind of like the running back position where Seattle's only got 3 running backs on the roster right now. And I know there's some fans like, yeah, but we used second-round picks the last couple of years. Yeah, but DJ Dallas is gone. You just had another player, Bryant Koback, who retired, and he's now on the retired reserve list. 3 running backs ain't going to cut it in this league with how much these guys get hurt. And I think at receiver, you could never have too much depth either, especially in today's game. So those are both positions on day 3, especially the running back spot. There's not blue chippers necessarily in this class, but you have a lot of depth on day 3 with guys that can catch the football too. There's a lot of third down potential options there. And I think you can get some really good receivers on day 3 that have special teams, kick return capabilities, especially with the new rules in place for this year. So I wouldn't be surprised if they pick a player at both those spots, especially if they add a couple picks through trade downs.
So Corbin, with the fact that you, like you said earlier, you got some guys, you got about 3 players that you would think John Schneider would stick and pick at 16. That leaves a massive gap to 81. So how do you think John Schneider would possibly recoup some of that if there was someone he, Verse or Fatanu or one of those guys, Cooper DeJean sitting there at 16, he sticks and picks. Do you think there's a way for him to recoup some capital in day 2 besides pick 81 there and maybe get into the second round? Is it possibly trading a guy like maybe a Darrell Taylor or picks from next year to get him in there? Or do you think he just waits out that entire period?
See, I think there's only a couple of options that would be at his disposal there. And I know the first one would be one a lot of 12s don't want to hear. That's trading DK Metcalf. I mean, maybe you could net another first round pick doing that. If I'm the GM, I'm not going that route. But those are the kind of players that you have to be able to dangle out there if you're wanting to acquire high picks, especially on draft weekend. And as far as giving up future picks, John Schneider's done that in the past, but it's usually been with day 3 selections. So if there's a guy there in the middle of the second round, if you're wanting to get into the second round, usually you have to give up a first to do that. Picks that are valued around lower since they're future selections. And that's usually how it goes. Or you have to give up next year's second and another pick on day 3, some kind of a package like that. If there's a player they really want in the second round, I would say that that's a potential possibility for John Schneider, but they have such limited draft capital compared to some of the teams out there. I don't know that they're going to be wanting to give up high picks for next year to do that. If the right player is available, then certainly John Schneider could consider it. But it feels like if they don't trade down, guys, it's going to be pretty tough for them to get a day 2 pick. Maybe you could trade down from 81 when you finally get up and try to get it where you get 3 picks in the 4th round and maybe add another pick in the later rounds. But as far as getting it in the meat of the draft, which is day 2, it would be pretty tricky unless you're going to move a young player like DK Metcalf to try to make it happen. Because Tyler Lockett's not moving, and teams aren't going to be giving up second and thirds for him anyway if you were going to trade him. So they just don't have a lot of options at their disposal there if they were wanting to do that.
Yeah, Corbin, you brought, when I asked you earlier, and that's why you said, probably 80-20 as far as like trading down, because that's just a lot easier than trying to give up, the future or DK Metcalf, who we're both we're just in love with, and especially Ryan Grubbin here coming in here and having the opportunity to work with a guy like DK, and also, but it is interesting because when you look at this team, we were talking to a couple other guys and they were talking about the fact that you kind of look at both sides of the football are sort of in a little different situation, right? Where this offense is like a little older. You got Tyler and Geno veterans and DK becoming that veteran player. And then this defense with a little younger and a lot more question marks, you're sort of on kind of 2 different spectrums. And that's kind of a unique situation. I'm not sure if you've kind of seen it like that, but I guess that could open up the door where there could be some kind of interesting movement like that.
I actually think that when you look at the offensive and defensive depth charts from an age and experience standpoint, I see a lot of parallels because on offense, you've got Geno, you've got Lockett, and DK is still a pretty young player, even though he's been in the league for a while. He was 21 when they brought him in. So he's still a pretty young player. You got a lot of really youthful players on the offensive line, which is kind of an issue. You'd like to have a little more experience in the trenches, but running backs are both in their first couple of years in the league. So it feels like the offense, yeah, there's some older players, but there's still a lot of really good young talent there. You think Jackson Smith and Jigba's going to be a breakout candidate this year. But on defense, you've got Jaron Reed, you've got Leonard Williams, you've got Draymond Jones, Uchenna Nwosu. In the secondary, you brought in Rayshon Jenkins, who's north of 30. So, there are quite a few veterans that are going to be playing snaps on Sundays for this team. And yet you've got those young guys, your Boye Maffe's, your Devin Witherspoons of the world. The linebackers, Jerome Baker's kind of like DK Metcalf in the sense he's only 27, but he's been a 6-year starter in the NFL. So I actually think that you look at this roster construction, they kind of are in the same, at least in my opinion, I think they are kind of in the same spot. Maybe if you look at the quarterback spot with a little more weight, you say, yeah, you'd like to have that future guy, but they did bring in Sam Howell. So I actually think from a roster building standpoint, John Schneider's probably pretty pleased with the fact that they've got a lot of those 1-year Band-Aids, and maybe a few of those guys end up lasting longer than that. But they've positioned themselves where they hopefully can compete this year. We'll see what they do in the draft, but they have a lot of young pieces to build around still as well.
So, Corbin, one position group we haven't really touched on yet within the draft and within, like you just said, the defense is that linebacker room that they've basically completely gutted in a way. I know they brought back, I think Drake Thomas is still under contract and maybe Patrick O'Connell as well.
Both those guys are, yep.
But you bring in Jerome Baker and Tyler Dotson. Do you think that's an area where they're going to look for someone, maybe if they can trade back and recoup a day 2 or a couple day 2 picks, or maybe early day 3? Do you think that's a group that they're going to address with multiple picks or maybe just one?
I think that really boils down to if they're able to get the player they want on day 2. I think that this is a position, giving 1-year contracts to Baker and Dodson, that they probably explained this in the free agency process. There's a chance that we will bring in somebody fairly early that's going to be coming in right away to compete with you guys. And there's some intriguing names. I don't think this is a great linebacker class. I think there's a huge drop-off after day 2. But if Junior Colson's there, we know the link he's got with Mike MacDonald playing for him at Michigan. I like Cedric Gray out of North Carolina. He's a really athletic guy. I'd have Colson ahead of him, but I think both those guys have the talent to be day 2 selections. You've got Wilson from NC State, who, if you didn't have the injury history, I think might be in consideration for the first linebacker off the board. I don't know if he's as good of a fit for this particular scheme that Mike MacDonald's running as what Junior Colson would be. I think once you get past the first 3 or 4 players, you have a lot of question marks, and you could take some gambles on guys on day 3, right, like a Tyrese Knight from UTEP, who, if coached up, could be a solid NFL player, but he's raw. He's sushi raw. There's a lot of guys like that on day 3. Maybe then you would double dip to try to see if you can hit on one of them. So I think that is a position that's kind of going to be fluid. Who's available there on day 2? And if the right guy's there, then yes, we're going to prioritize, but we're not going to reach for a player either in those early rounds, especially if you're only picking at 81 and you don't have a second rounder. There's going to be limited resources there. And if the right guy's not there in this pretty thin class, then I think that might change their hand a little bit as far as what they can do.
Hey, Corbin, when you look at what John's done in free agency so far and how this roster is starting to assemble, like you said, there's a mix of veterans and young guys on both sides of the ball. How are you liking this roster going into the draft compared to 1 year ago today going into the draft? Do you like the look of this roster over last year's? Obviously, there's quite a turnover in obviously the linebacker and safeties, like completely different guys going on there. What was your overall feeling with what John's done in free agency and just how this roster is looking now? Are you confident with this team as far as going in the draft and having a pretty competitive team, or do you still look at 24 as just another building block and get ready for sort of 25, 26 sort of explosion?
I'm still kind of in that torn phase. I'm torn on whether I think this roster is better or whether it's stagnated. And the reason I'm saying that, I am really encouraged by the state of the skill positions. I like the secondary addition. Rayshon Jenkins is a very solid player. When you look at what he's done in Jacksonville and before that with the Chargers, he's going to give you some positional flexibility. The 2 linebackers have a chance to be pretty rock solid this year on 1-year deals. It feels like the edge rusher group, getting Uchenna Nwosu back, is massive for this football team. And so I think that there are some areas. I like the D-line too, getting Leonard Williams back. I think Draymond Jones has a chance to be much more productive playing in this scheme. I just felt like this coaching staff last year didn't do a great job of putting him in positions to necessarily be successful. So from those standpoints, I think you can make some arguments that bang for the buck wise, that this is a slightly better roster than when it was this time of year. But then you look at the offensive line, you're going to have 3 new starters in the interior I have confidence in Olu Oluwatimi, but he started one game. So there's a lot of unknowns there at the NFL level. Anthony Bradford, I thought had a really rough game as a starter last year. There were some flashes, but he went through some significant growing pains. What does year 2 look like for him? And he's kind of the elder statesman there with Laken Tomlinson now coming into the fold. Tomlinson had a rough year with the Jets last year, but I think the film is better than the stats. So maybe there's a bounce back possibility on short term there. You've just got a lot of question marks. You're putting stock in guys like Tremaine Ankrum, saying, is he going to be able to play for us when he started one game for the Rams in 4 years? That, to me, that position group, having some questions about the depth that you've had at tackle. What's Abraham Lucas going to look like coming off those injuries last year? I really think the offensive line is the one position group that makes me hesitant to say that I think this team is ahead of where it was last year. And so that does put some pressure on what they're doing in the draft from that standpoint, and trying to add some more really good pieces at the skill positions at linebacker. There's still some pressure there. So I think that it's one of those things where I think you can make arguments either way. And so it's a little bit inconclusive until we see what this draft looks like as a whole after, or what this roster looked like until after the draft.
So Corbin, I have a question because, like you said there with, the way that the team looks in comparison to last year and the whole vibe around the construction of the team, what's it like been in the building now that Mike MacDonald's come in? They've made this massive shift from Pete Carroll and that whole staff to what Mike MacDonald's brought in with his staff, which outside of Leslie Frazier, there's a lot of, I wouldn't say inexperience, but not nearly a lot of NFL experience in some of those positions, Ryan Grubb being one, Scott Huff. So what's been your thought on the whole vibe around that building? You've been in there. What kind of, is it different? And if it is so, how different is it?
Honestly, I don't think that I don't feel like it's a huge difference at this point. Obviously, you're bringing a new playbook. You have a much different personality that is head coach. You've got some different personalities on your coaching staff, but the players seem to be pretty excited right now about where things are going with this group. And I think that there's still a lot of high energy. It seems like the culture, a lot of people are going to say the basketball hoop's gone, but whoop-de-doo, who cares? But I think that the culture, John Schneider was making that a top priority when he was looking for a new coach. He didn't want the culture that he and Pete Carroll cultivated to just disappear. And I think Mike MacDonald has done a good job here these first few weeks of trying to send the right message to get buy-in while still having that positive mentality, that positive culture where guys want to come to work. It seems like guys are fired up for this opportunity. So it's still very early in the process until we get actually onto the field and you get to see how things are playing out in OTAs and eventually training camp. It's way too early to just rush to judgment and say, well, Mike MacDonald is going to be able to take this torch and run with it. But I do think that he is off to a solid start where he has been able to take care of those ever so important steps as a new coach, where you're getting players to buy in. The fact that there's a lot of veterans, you see the pictures on Seahawks.com, there's a lot of veterans that are there for the start of this program. I think that is significant in itself because a lot of times these coaching changes, you don't see those veterans around, but you see DK Metcalf in the weight room. You see Julian Love in the weight room. And some of these guys that are going to be leaders for this football team. That sends a pretty positive message right there. Uchenna Nwosu coming off his injury needs to be there to rehab still. But those guys being there, it sends a positive message that, hey, Mike MacDonald has sent a positive message to his players here early, and they're off to a fast start, which is what you want at this time. And there's a lot of work to do. But I think at this point, obviously, the building is going to have some slight changes when Pete Carroll's no longer the man in charge, and Mike MacDonald is not the same personality. But I think there are more parallels between those guys in the way that they view managing people and managing the roster than what people may realize. And I think there's going to be quite a bit of carryover there from that perspective.
Do you think some of that excitement, do you think it's a balance of, obviously, taking a Mike and what he's sort of bringing, like you said, John Schneider trying to find a guy, obviously, the guy seems like a genius on the defensive side of the ball, but at the same time, keeping some of that culture. Do you think some of the excitement is a balance between that and also, players, felt that some of the guys, especially veteran guys, that there needed to be that change, and that's not a slight on Pete, obviously, but 14 years is a long time. to be in that position. And do you think that is part of it right now?
I think you can make an argument that both those things are part of the equation. And I know there's been some fans that have been seeing quotes from like Uchenna Nwosu saying we have the right coaching staff in place. That is not a shot at Pete Carroll. He had the utmost respect for him. But this was something that I was looking at the last couple of years. It just felt like the coaching staff that Pete Carroll assembled just wasn't where it was, anywhere close to where it was when this team was competing for Super Bowls in the early 2010s. You just didn't have the guys that were getting, your coaching staff is effective when you have guys getting plucked away by other teams. And it's been a long time since other teams came knocking saying, can I have your offensive coordinator as my head coach? Can I have your defensive coordinator as my head coach? Can I have your cornerbacks coach as my new defensive coordinator? When was the last time that we saw significant losses from the coaching staff in that regard? It just didn't happen. And it felt like, I think to an extent, Pete Carroll was victimized by keeping his own coaches and promoting them. And I think that there's a balancing act that has to be done there. And I think that it got to a point where, aside from Shane Waldron, they really were bringing in guys that they already had ties with, that had coached there, and just kind of moving them up the ladder. And some of those guys were not ready for promotions into it. And that, I think that is really what guys like Uchenna Nwosu are speaking to here, that we needed to shake things up with the actual coaching staff. Assistants are crucial at any level of football, but especially in the NFL. You have to have position coaches that are able to get guys playing at their very best. And I think that the Seahawks, aside from a handful of guys the last few years, I don't think they were getting anywhere close to that. And that impacted the results on game day.
So, Corbin, now that Mike MacDonald's obviously in place, and like you said, the culture is going to stay the same. That was a big thing for John Schneider. Do you see players like Doug Baldwin, Cliff Averill, Michael Bennett, those guys still being around the facility as much as they were? Or do you think that was a byproduct of Pete being there and that whole regime that was there at the time? Do you now see the 2010 players, alum, that have such a huge tie to the city of Seattle kind of no longer being around the team as much now?
I think that's something we won't know till we get to training camp and see which guys show up. I mean, you're not going to be seeing those guys walking around in the building this time of year anyway. I could see Mike MacDonald trying to, from a PR standpoint, I could see him trying to have a bridge a little bit there, like, hey, we don't want to push you guys away necessarily, but it's likely that you're going to see less of those players there just because Pete is no longer involved. And the assistants that he had, I mean, Carl Scott's been on the staff for 2 years. He wasn't on the staff when players like Doug Baldwin and Richard Sherman and those guys were playing in Seattle. There's not really common denominators there aside from John Schneider. And maybe Schneider is enough to sway some of these guys to come out. And I'm sure he would keep the door open for those players to return. But the links as far as the coaching staff are not going to be there. We'll see. Mike MacDonald might be putting that bridge out there. Hey, we still want to keep you guys from these legendary teams involved in our program. I think smart coaches do that. Wouldn't be surprised if that's how Seattle handles it. At the same time, I wouldn't expect to see 4 or 5 of these guys roaming the training camp fields every day like we've seen in the last several years just because of that coaching change.
Yeah, hey Corbin, we really appreciate you hanging out. Just a couple quick things. So kind of playing off that, obviously, KJ Wright, got a coaching job down in San Francisco, and there was talks that he wanted to possibly coach here. Do you think that was a when you look at it, and you always hear like, hey, this is the Legion of Boom 2.0, and some of those players are, everyone's trying to compare, when like a Devin Witherspoon shows up, like, hey, this the start of the Legion of Boom 2.0. Instead of, you think Mike sort of didn't want that around, like, say, okay, KJ is, as much as we love him, like we love him as a player, loved his podcast, everything about him. I didn't want to see him go get that job in San Fran. But do you think part of that is like, we want to just sort of have that as the past, like not have some of these guys sort of, be a part of like KJ in there in that staff, as far as just maybe that extra pressure to be this Legion of Boom 2.0? Do you think anything like that has something to do with stuff like that?
I think if that was a factor, it was a small one, because from my understanding, they put strong consideration in KJ Wright potentially joining this staff. What ultimately happened is that Mike MacDonald brought in somebody that he coached to be a coach in Josh Bynes. And he coached him 2 different stints in Baltimore. And I just think understanding the scheme from playing in it and having that connection, I don't blame Mike MacDonald for wanting to go that route. He had never coached KJ Wright. He didn't have that prior relationship. So I don't think it had anything to do with them saying, or if it did, it was a very, very small factor trying to move away from the past. I think KJ Wright has a chance to be a very good coach. We saw him as a coach on the field all those years in Seattle. I just think it wasn't the best fit for them. And Josh Bynes was a better fit with that connection, the fact that he played for Mike MacDonald just a couple of years ago, played for him. And so this is a guy that's going to get his first coaching opportunities. Well, they both had the same amount of NFL experience. They neither coached at this level. So MacDonald went with the more familiar name and somebody that he had trusted coaching for a number of years that kind of had that coach on the field mentality for the Ravens all those years. So I don't think that it was really about trying to push away players that were from the Pete Carroll era as much as, hey, KJ, we love you, but this is the better fit for us at this time.
So, Corbin, I got one final question for you here about a couple guys in that defensive front 7 that I'm wondering what your thoughts are for their second-year jumps, and that's Derek Hall, Mike Morris, and Cameron Young. How much of a factor do you think either one of them will play? And do you see for, like, say, Derek Hall, a jump like Boy Mafe had this past season from year 1 to year 2?
I don't think that it would be fair to expect him to come out and get 9.5 sacks in his second season, and especially because Mafe showed more flashes in his rookie year than what Derek Hall did. Hall didn't have any sacks last year, only had 5 quarterback hits. I like the player a lot, though, and I think being in a scheme where he is going to be coached up better, I felt like that was just, again, that was a universal issue for this football team the last couple of years. How many times do you see guys out of place gap-wise and blown assignments? It just didn't seem like guys were coached up. They were prepared the way they needed to be. So if you can just shore that part up, Derek Hall's got the athleticism. He's got the want to. He's got the power off the edge where he can emerge as a viable rotational rusher and maybe in time still be a starter caliber player. I do think that it's going to be one of the more fascinating players to watch just because last year, by and large, it was a pretty quiet, discrepant season. There just wasn't very much going on. So we'll have to see where he fits, but I think that he's got the tools to be a good end in this system. We have to see how he ends up adapting to this coaching staff and how they maximize his skill set. As for the 2 guys in the middle, Mike Morris, when he went down in week 1, that really bummed me out because I loved what I saw at training camp. And I'm sticking with this. This is an injury that he had coming into the league. Now that he's had it repaired, he's going to be healthy, reuniting with Mike MacDonald, who's going to know how to best utilize him. I think he is the wild card to watch on that defensive line that could have a far greater impact than people realize. You've got Leonard Williams, you've got Jaron Reed, you've got Draymond Jones. Mike Morris could be pushing a few of those veterans at some point, though, and it's possible that he could be the successor to Jaron Reed in that lineup eventually. So he's a player that I still have a lot of high expectations for that I thought really flashed last year before his shoulder messed up again and unfortunately had to have surgery. And Cameron Young, now you've got a true nose tackle that you can learn from. Jonathan Hankins, sometimes those guys that have played for 4 or 5 teams, sometimes they're the best mentors that you can bring in because they've been in a number of systems. And Hankins has always been a very coachable player. You talk to anybody that's worked with him, he's a very coachable player that understands the game and is widely a beloved teammate. Guys in Dallas loved him. Players in Raiders loved him. Those are the kind of guys you want to have as veteran presences for younger players. And I thought Cameron Young had some flashes last year. Even a couple times saw him get after as a pass rusher, which he didn't really do ever at Mississippi State. So he might still be a guy that can carve out a long-term role. He's a smaller nose. he's going to have to learn some tricks of the trade. Jonathan Hankins will be a good guy for him to learn from. So I think it's possible all three of these guys could contribute more this year. I would say Mike Morris is the one of the three, though, that I have the most optimism that he's going to be able to really hit the ground running, not just because he knows Mike MacDonald, but I just look at the size, the athleticism playing inside, and I think that there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, final one for me too. If you were to look at your expectations for the 2024 season, and I'm not, talking a win total, but what are your expectations for the 2024 season?
I would go against the people that are expecting this team to come out and win 5 or 6 games. I know you mentioned not to throw out win-loss totals, but I think that this team is going to remain competitive. They didn't completely rip down the ship or tear down the building. I mean, you've still got a lot of really talented players. What is going to ultimately decide how this team does? There are two things. One, how does the defense function with Mike MacDonald in implementing his scheme? How many growing pains do they go through? Can they mesh the new players with the returning players? And the offensive line. To me, the offensive line is going to be the ultimate factor here. If they aren't able to find serviceable starters in the interior, it's not going to matter how many good players they have at receiver, running back, what Geno Smith's capable of. They're not going to be able to play to their full potential because of that O-line. So that is still the biggest concern for me. I think that there's some players there that have the potential to be really good, but this is a young unit and there's a lot of question marks there, and really just see how the defense comes together. I think the roster has the talent to still be an 8 to 10 win, maybe if everything goes right, 11 or 12 wins caliber roster. But there are some things that could hold them back. They're not going to be looking to tank, though. Don't ever expect that. I think that this is going to be a solid team. I just, at this point, I couldn't tell you whether or not this team has playoff capability without seeing how the draft goes and what they're able to really ultimately do with that offensive line and trying to get all their parts together on defense.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I agree. I think that this team is going to be competitive, and there's just too many good players for people to expect this to be a 4 or 5 win team, and that goes back to even when first year when Geno started. I think people got excited when they don't know much about the Pacific Northwest, and then they hear the headlines of Russell Wilson getting traded, and they're automatically thinking worst team in the league, and obviously that didn't happen. So yeah, it's going to be exciting, a lot to look forward to, especially in the next couple of weeks coming up here in this draft. It's going to be exciting. So Corbin, we really appreciate you coming on, really appreciate your time. Why don't you let our viewers know how to find all your work? We know you got the podcast going on, so how can kind of people find you and subscribe to all your stuff?
Yeah, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. I post all my articles on there, SeahawksSI.com/NFL/Seahawks. You can find all of my articles there. And then 5 or 6 podcasts a week with Locked On Seahawks. You can find us on YouTube and any other platform that you listen to your podcast. Subscribe for free. Again, we do 5 or 6 episodes a week during the season. Sometimes we do 7. We're pretty busy. We have a lot of content. So those are the avenues you can find my stuff.
Awesome stuff, man. Well, again, Corbin, we appreciate you coming on, and love to talk to you in the future here.
Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
All right.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Corbin.
Corbin. Guys, that was Corbin Smith, beat writer for the Seahawks. Also does a lot of podcasts. So guys, go find him and go subscribe to Corbin, because doing it a long time. He's in there, he's in the facility, and knows all the ins and outs of what's happening. Interesting conversation with Corbin, man. Lots to talk about. Obviously the first half we really hit the draft hard. Then we kind of took it towards, hey, what are the expectations of this team? Who do you like kind of as a second year guy? You brought up some guys that people forget about that sometimes. It's like, yeah, we drafted Derek Hall and Mike Morris, a guy that we haven't even seen yet. There's 2 guys that are legitimate, guys that we were high on. And it's like, wait a second. Yeah, let's not write them off. And that's kind of all part of the process when you're going into this draft, that fans have to realize, hey, it's not just, what happened last year. Who are some of these guys that have potential to come up that are still on this roster? And then, are surprised, oh, wait, we didn't take, a DN in the first couple of rounds, like what's going on, right? So it's kind of a whole. You got to look at the whole picture.
No, 100%. And that's the one thing that I look at with what Corbin was kind of, talking about it in the whole thing was it's not going to be a 1-year fix it. It's going to be this year, next year. They're going to still be competitive. They're still going to have the ability to, possibly win. Like he said, 10 or 11, 12 games. Don't expect this team to be horrible. Don't expect them to tank. They're going to be a competitive football team. Yeah, there's been changeover, but there hasn't been enough where it's going to make that much of a difference in what happened between last year and this year. So, no, I definitely agree. The one thing I found interesting with Corbin, though, was he seems to be in favor, or he seems to think that they're going to kick the can down the road on the quarterback position to 2025. But the name that he mentioned that was interesting to me was Michael Pratt. They did have a couple of meetings with him. I'm definitely going to dive a little bit deeper into his tape and see, some more stuff on Pratt and see if he is a viable day 3 option. So it'll be definitely interesting to see what kind of comes out of that situation going forward, and ultimately what does Seattle do with that first round pick?
Yeah, there is some question marks. I think he even said, "Listen, Rattler was in the building. He's not going to be a day 3 guy." And I think I, didn't mean that. I think that he's. I agree. I think he could go as high as the second round, but he did say, "Hey, if he is sitting there at 81, that's a guy you have to look at." So I think he's kind of saying, "Yeah, they could kick the can, but if there's a player that they like that falls to them there, they're going to be open to taking him." Because I think you and I talked about that too, right? Like you kick the can, and with Corbin, how he's saying this is a competitive team. Shit, this team could win 12 games if everything goes good. So again, you're going to be in that similar position like you and I talked about. You're not going to be a part of the top 3 quarterbacks, right? So um unless you're making big splashes like trading guys like DK Metcalf, and then, is that what you want to do? So it's fine, to say kick the can, but again, like he also is looking at it. Yeah, but if a guy's there in the 3rd round that you think could be that guy, you take him. And it's interesting when we have a lot of these guys come on like Corbin, and we've had, Emery Hunt, the last podcast, and then other guys prior to, and guys are, everyone's got a little different opinion on the quarterbacks, and that's what we do, right? Like guys evaluate and watch film and talk to different guys. Some guys are really high on Jordan Travis, and then Corbin's like, what, I can see it, but I can go, oh, this is kind of my comparison to what he might be in this league and how he throws the football and stuff like that. So and that's the cool thing about having different perspectives and opinions, and really guys that break down tape, because they all sort of, some agree, but then you sort of say, okay, yeah, I can see what you're saying there. And you kind of go back and you watch the tape, and then it kind of gives, people who are watching the show and even ourselves kind of like, okay, you put Jordan Travis's tape back on, and now it's like, okay, based on what a few guys said, maybe now it kind of gives you a little more info to sort of break down the tape even further.
No, 100%. And that's one thing that I really appreciate with these conversations for me. Like I'm kind of a quarterback guy. That's my thing. And I like diving into these, different quarterbacks, whether they're already in the league, free agent options or things like that, or draft options. And, even with Gino and stuff, and watching his film and Sam Howell's. But when we have these conversations with these guys, it allows me to go back and reevaluate that and see what they're seeing and be able to put that with what I'm seeing and get a more broad or more, full kind of picture of that potential player and what they can and can't do well. So like I said earlier, I'm definitely going to dive back into the Michael Pratt film and see, is there stuff in there that I may have missed, or is there something in Jordan Travis's film that I maybe didn't see right away? And then if I see it, it might change slightly my opinion on Jordan Travis. But ultimately, yeah, I'm really excited to see kind of what they do with that. And another one I'm going to dive deeper into is Sam Howell. Like I've been pretty deep in Sam, but I'm going to go deeper in, Corbin seems quite high that this guy has upside starter potential. It could be really interesting in Seattle that, like you said, if Gino starts out slow, there's no real connection between Gino and this new coaching staff.
Yeah.
And if he starts slow, maybe Sam comes in and Sam takes the job mid-season or something like that may occur.
Yeah, no, that's true too. So that's gonna be interesting to see because, like you said, they want to get a valuation on Sam, right? I mean, they brought him in here for a reason. We don't think it's just strictly for a backup. You know, they're bringing him in because they say, okay, you know, maybe this could be a guy leading forward too. We'll see. But you know what, man, something to look at. Breaking down some more film. We're a couple weeks out. But yeah, awesome having Corbin on, man, and yeah, I'd love to get him back on. So, but yeah, that's all for us tonight, man. Just wrapping it all up. And like I said, guys, we're a couple weeks out. And yeah, so we're getting really, really close and really excited. So that's it for us tonight, man. So let's catch you guys in the next episode here.
Go Hawks.
Go Hawks.